my name is Beck and welcome to the Contradictions Book Tag. I was actually tagged to do this by Grace over at G-Swizzle, so I will link her video down below, as well as all the stuff related to this tag, but let's get into the questions. Question 1 is, I love this genre, but I don't love this book. And I love the genre of fantasy, specifically adult fantasy, where there's a massive quest, there's usually a chosen one. I love all that stuff. I just eat it up. But unfortunately, I thought I would enjoy this book and I ended up putting it down about 170 pages in, and that is The Furious of Calderon by Jim Butcher, which is kind of like hearsay because I adore Jim Butcher's Dresden Files series, but for some reason I just couldn't like this. And I think it's because in the Dresden Files as well, it is prevalent, where there's a very strong male gaze aspect, and so the female characters and the sexualization of them is just quite overdone. And in some part I can kind of quote unquote excuse it because Dresden is written from a first person perspective, from a 30-year-old male character who's quite hot-blooded. So you can kind of see in his perspective how he'd get caught up in the physicalities of people he's attracted to. Not that I'm necessarily going, oh yeah, first person, over-sexualization of women. Love that. Not the case at all. It's not something that I want to excuse either, but it's something that I've noticed about the series that I can kind of just draw a line against and go, it's okay because for some reason it just doesn't get on my nerves as much as it did in here. And I think that might be because maybe this is earlier in his career. I'm not sure at what stage he published this, but the roles of women and their sexualization just didn't feel quite right. The writing was quite slow and the characterization was just lackluster compared to how I'm used to him writing in the Dresden Files. And I think that might be down to potentially the perspective, but maybe because he's taking on a lot more in this book than he did in the Dresden Files, because it's an urban fantasy, it's set in a world we already know, whereas in this book it's completely in a fantasy world, so there's a lot to build up at once. So maybe I'm just getting stuck because it's like the first book in a series and it's got a lot to set up, but at the same time I shouldn't have to force myself or work to read something when I should be enjoying it. And it's not like I gave it 20 pages and went, nah, not for me. I gave it 170 pages. That's quite a lot of this book. So I'm not going to read a 600-page book if I'm not vibing with it, and so unfortunately I ended up DNFing it. Question number 2 is, I rarely read this genre, but I loved this book. And if you know me, you know that I don't really touch non-fiction just because I can't get my brain to like it. However, when I was like 16, 17, I read Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden, and this is him recounting the story of a geisha woman who did voice recordings and talked to him directly in order to write her memoir that was published after either she died or after the people in the story had passed away, and maybe she had as well. So she didn't want to publish it while there were people in the work that were still alive. So that's why he was telling the story, as far as I believe. And I read this when I was a teenager, and also Buddy read it at the time with my mum. So I think because I had that experience of being able to discuss the book in real time, that meant that I loved it. Question number 3 is, I really love this trope, but I really didn't like this book. And the trope would be the ragtag group which goes on a quest, which is what happened in Aurora Rising and Aurora Burning by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. But I think I've actually decided to downsize my rating of Aurora Burning from a 3 stars to a 2 stars, because while I loved the first half, the second half just felt very lackluster, very convenient, and not like the writers that were writing it. So the writers, Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff, have written series before, they've collaborated before, and so when it came to the way they write things, I had confidence that they wouldn't just fall easily into tropes or into shock value or anything, and they kind of did. And so I felt quite betrayed and very disappointed by the way the characters reacted in a story when they'd been built up otherwise. So it was just very frustrating and disappointing. It destroyed the whole group dynamic for me, and I've therefore not decided to continue and read the 3rd book in the series, because if I was that disappointed, what's the point? Question number 4 is, I hated this trope, but I loved this book. And the trope is miscommunication. I hate it when characters don't talk to each other, and that's what drives the plot. And ultimately that happened a little bit in this book, and that is The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. It's the 2nd book in the Mistborn series, and Vin in this book, or in this series rather, is quite a quiet and very internal character. She really struggles with trust, and it's a massive identity arc that she has to address over the course of this trilogy, which is brilliant for character growth, but when she's in it, it's very annoying. So there was a character that is a key character in her life in this book. I'm not going to spoil anything, obviously, because second book in a trilogy. And because she's not talking to this character, the plot kind of comes to a little bit of a halt. And you can see different problems arise because she's not communicated, but they're not problems that are necessarily overarching. They're just problems that could have been avoided if she'd had a conversation. So I saw that and I was like, oh, because to me it really smacked of a writer early in their career writing a story that needed some kind of tension, but they weren't sure how to do that, and therefore they've made their character not communicate. So that's what frustrated me about this, but ultimately there were so many things I loved about this book and in this series in general that I could kind of accept it rather than go, I hate this, I'm putting it down, because this is a book series that I love and it's an author that I like as well. So maybe I'm biased, but in this case, I could only just excuse it. Question number 5 is, I loved this author, but I didn't love this book. And for me, I adore Robin Hobb, but I tried reading Shamans Crossing, which is a book series that's not part of her Elderling series. So it doesn't follow Fitz and the Fool. It's not the Live Ship Traders or the Rainwilds. Those are completely different series set in a different world. This is set in a completely different place, a completely different time and characters and different world entirely. And it follows a soldier son. So in his family, in this world, I think the sons in a family are born for specific roles, and he's born second or third, and I think that's for the soldier. So that person in the family is naturally going to be sent away to the war. So I think that's ultimately why he gets sent away. But again, he's an unreliable narrator and he's got magic, but you don't really understand it very well. And so it feels like the same mechanisms that I loved about the Farseer trilogy with Fitz, because he's kind of an unreliable narrator. He does have magic, but we don't learn about it entirely straight away. But I love the way that world was developed with his voice, and it came into focus as Fitz started to notice things, whereas in this series, it just had the opposite effect on me, which is interesting given that it's the same writer that I love. So I just didn't love it, but I did read it, or try to read it, when I was about 16, and I've grown quite considerably since then. So maybe if I go back now, I might like it, but I just remember being so betrayed by it when I tried it, because I was like, it's not Fitz, I don't like it, this story is not good. And that's an emotional response. So maybe I will like it if I revisit it, but I just haven't had the bravery to do so yet. Question number 6 is, I previously disliked a book by this author, but now I've loved this book. And my answer to this is inverted. So during the entirety of last year, I kept reading books by authors that I'd read from before, and I just found I didn't love them, which was very disappointing. And that's why this year I've ultimately embraced DNFing things, because I'm not going to stick to something that I'm not loving. Hence DNFing Furious of Calderon, even though I love the Dresden Files, and even though I'm probably going to try the Aeronaut's Windlass by that author as well. It doesn't mean I'm giving up on the author, I'm just giving up on that particular book. So this has happened for several authors for me, but the two that come to mind are Sylvain Neuvel, who wrote the Themis Files, so Sleeping Giants, and also another series that I loved as well called The Test. It was a little novella, but he also wrote The History of What Comes Next, which was a sci-fi set in this world, but kind of historical because it took place at the same time as the space race. And I remember wanting to love it, but I just hated it and I gave it 2 stars. And then additionally, I also read The 22 Murders of Madison May by Max Barry, and he also wrote Lexicon, and I loved Lexicon. So when I read The 22 Murders, I was like, this is going to be so good. It's like a sci-fi but parallel universes with a serial killer traversing each universe. So it sounded amazing, but I really found it lackluster, and I gave it also 2 stars. So those are just 2 things, and I'm not going to dip into the rest, that I found quite disappointing. Question number 7 is, I love this cover and I didn't love this book, and that is the UK cover for Spinning Silver. Didn't love the book. I know a lot of people did, but I just didn't. I just don't like fairy tale retellings or fairy tale kind of esque vibes in general, so that also alienated me from this. I also liked Uprooted, but I didn't love it. I think at the time I gave it a 4, but I'd probably reflect and give it a 3 now. It's just a style that's not really my thing, but I do really admire the book covers for this, especially those UK hardcover editions. They are gorgeous. And then question number 8 is, I loved this book, but I didn't like this cover, and that is The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. Does this not look like Jensen Ackles to anybody else? It is supposed to be Vin, and Vin is like a 17-year-old 17-year-old girl. This does not look like a 17-year-old girl, at least to me. It looks like supernatural. I cannot get past this. Maybe the US cover looks better because I've forgotten what it looks like, because I primarily get the UK covers because those are what are available in Australia. But maybe I should invest in the US covers for this, but I'm not a huge fan of those either. So I'm just gonna have to stick with Jensen Ackles' Vin. And then question number 9 is tag someone, and I can't remember who Grace tagged, so I guess you're tagged and everyone who's watching is tagged. Please let me know if you do this tag down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll come chat to you down in the comments, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.